Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Shaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Udiraye. We're reading from Śrimad Bhāgavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 31, the movements of the living entities. And today's verses will be 30 and 31. Bhutai panchibirarabde Dehe dehyat kudo sukrit Aham amitya sadgraha Karoti kumatir matim. Bhutai, by material elements. Panchibhi, 5. Arabde, made. Dehe, in the body. Dehi, the living entity. Abuddha, ignorant. Asakrit, constantly. Aham, I. Mama, mine. Iti, thus. Asat, non-permanent things. Graha, accepting. Karoti, he does. Kumati, being foolish. Matim, thought. By such ignorance, the living entity accepts the material body, which is made of 5 elements, as himself. With this misunderstanding, he accepts non-permanent things as his own and increases his ignorance in the darkest region. Purport. The expansion of ignorance is explained in this verse. The first ignorance is to identify one's material body, which is made of 5 elements, as the self. And the second is to accept something as one's own due to a bodily connection. In this way, ignorance expands. The living entity is eternal, but because of his accepting non-permanent things, misidentifying his interest, he is put into ignorance, and therefore he suffers material pangs. Text 31. Tadartam kurute karma yad badho yati samsutim yonu yati dadat klesham vidya karma bandhana tadartam kurute karma yad badho yati samsutim yonu yati dadat klesham vidya karma bandhana. Would a few devotees like to chant? Tadartam kurute karma yad badho yati samsmritim yati dadat klesham vidya karma bandhana. Tadartam kurute karma yad badho yati samsritim nonu yati dadat klesham vidya karma bandhana. Vaishnavis, tad artam kurute karma yad bado yati samsritim yo nu yati dadat klesham vidya karma bandhana tadartam kurute karma yad bado yati samsritim yo nu yati tadat klesham vidya. Word meanings. Tad artam. Tat artam. For the sake of the body. Kurute. He performs karma, actions. Yet vada. Bound by which. Yati. He goes. Samsritim. To repeated birth and death. Ya. Which body? Anuyati. Follows. Dadat. Giving. Klesham. Misery. Avidya. By ignorance. Karma. By fruit of activities. Bandhanaha. The cause of bondage. Translation, for the sake of the body, which is a source of constant trouble to him, and which follows him because he is bound by ties of ignorance, and fruit of activities, he performs various actions which cause him to be subjected to repeated birth and death. Srila Prabhupada's Purport. In Bhagavad Gita it is said that one has to work to satisfy Yajna or Vishnu. For any work done without the purpose of satisfying the Supreme Personality of Godhead is a cause of bondage. In the conditioned state, a living entity accepting his body as himself forgets his eternal relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead and acts on the interest of his body. He takes the body as himself, his bodily expansions as his kinsman, and the land from which his body is born as worshipable. In this way, he performs all sorts of misconceived activities which lead to his perpetual bondage in repetition of birth and death in various species. In modern civilization, the so-called social, national, and government leaders mislead people more and more under the bodily conception of life, with the result that all the leaders with their followers are gliding down to hellish conditions, birth after birth. An example is given in Śrimad Bhāgavatam, Andayatandhar Upaniyamana. When a blind man leads several other blind men, the result is that all of them fall down in a ditch. This is actually happening. There are many leaders to lead the ignorant public, but because every one of them is bewildered by the bodily conception of life, there's no peace and prosperity in human society. So-called yogis who perform various bodily feats are only in the same category as such, are also in the same category as such ignorant people, because the Hatha Yoga system is especially recommended for persons who are grossly implicated in the bodily conception. The conclusion is that as long as one is fixed in the bodily conception, he has to suffer birth and death. Om Ajnanatimidandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Nena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamaya Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Yuta Padakamalam Sri Gurun Vaishnavanscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatham Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Sadvatutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakam Vitamscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Mancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadara Shri Vasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Gaur Premanande Hare Hare. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be back here at the Shri Radha Govinda Mandir and to be in your association today. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. This is a chapter that reminds us, as Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu does when he, through the pen of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, sings Jeev Jago, Gaura Chandra Bohu, Kota Nidra Jao Maya, Pisha Chila Kore, saying that Bajibo Bolia Eshe, Sangsara Pitare, that you took birth, you have taken birth again and again, and referring to this section of the Bhāgavatam, a section which is repeated by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the Chaitanya Bhagavat when he's speaking to his mother. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is saying that while you were in the womb, you made a promise that I'll only serve you. Of course, as mentioned in this chapter, after 7 months, the fetus develops awareness, even while in the womb. And those souls who are fortunate come to the awareness that they've been in wombs like this many times. In fact, Bhāgavatam earlier than this, in the same chapter, says that a fortunate soul who's in the situation in the womb remembers 100 lifetimes and then comes to the consciousness or the conscious awareness that each time that soul has been in the womb and then has come out into the world, as is mentioned in the song Jeev Jago, he's forgotten the promise. If you've ever prayed to God, if you get me out of this one, I'll be good from now on, and then later on found yourself in a situation where you're again compromising, we can magnify that, because the Bhāgavatam does, by giving us this view of samsara, and one particular aspect of it is the agony of awakening in yet another womb, and then realizing, and I've done this before, the situation of the living entity in this world is that once in the womb and aware, the trauma of coming out through the birth channel, the Bhāgavatam describes, the living entity sometimes comes out not being able to breathe, and then has to start the breath, and then sometimes the living entity dies in the same body coming out of the womb. It's a traumatic experience. And as explained in the 11th canto of the Śrimad Bhāgavatam regarding a human being's or any soul's relationship with the material world, when in the womb, the senses are internalized. But once coming out of the womb, they become externalized. In fact, they already are externalized, as mentioned in the conversation between the Lord Brahma, the four Kumaras, and the Hamsavatar. They've asked, how is it that the living entity can come out of this ignorance? Similar question Devahuti asks to her son Kapila and says, when she says that it seems as if I've been here since a time immemorial, and it seems that I am my body. It seems that I am part of this material world. It's hard to tell the difference. It's hard to see myself as transcendental. What to speak of controlling the senses and the mind. And Hamsavatar says to the four Kumaras and to Brahma that the senses are part of material nature, and each one of the senses is already embedded within its sense object in the material world. What's more, the sense objects penetrate the mind. So there's an intimate relationship with the senses and the sense objects, and as soon as a soul in a material body, and here in this context we're speaking about a human coming out of the womb, then his or her senses become externalized and naturally gravitate towards or realize their symbiotic relationship with the external senses. And then it's no wonder that one is carried away in the dreamland, as is described also in this chapter, of being a separate enjoyer from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. 3 stages of consciousness for a conditioned soul. One is awakened consciousness. The next is consciousness of sleep with dreams. And the third is to be asleep without dreams. It's not that we're unconscious, but we're conscious of nothing. And the Bhāgavatam recommends that we become aware of the fact that we're still the same soul, even though we go through various stages of awareness throughout even a 24-hour period. When we awaken from sleep, we can surmise that, yes, I was sleeping, and now I'm awake, and now I'm conscious. And although the various states of consciousness for the soul change, we can become aware of the continuum, that I'm still the same person throughout. The problem, as is mentioned here very clearly, is ignorance. And I wrote down a couple of legal terms which you might be interested in. They're in regard to ignorance. And you may be interested to know, I hope, that in a court of law, there are several legal theories that are described as follows. One is called willful blindness. Willful blindness. What is it? Willful blindness. The facts exist, and there was purposeful action to avoid, but the person still did it. And a similar term in legal circles is contrived ignorance. Contrived ignorance. So I don't remember. I don't remember if I did it or not. And believe it or not, a third, well, you'll believe it because people like to use metaphors. It's also called there's an instruction that the jury gets from the judge in a case where somebody says, I don't remember if I did it or not. It's called the ostrich instruction. Because ostriches, well, you know what ostriches do. And the jury instruction is that the defense that I don't remember if I did it or not, in the face of facts, obvious purposeful action. Oh, probably you're back there. Do these sound familiar?
That sounds good for you.
Okay, sounds good. He's an attorney.
Maybe not good.
Not very good. Not very good. So there are two ways in which Srila Prabhupada in his purports describe how one becomes, first of all, attached to the bodily conception of life. And very categorically, or systematically, the Lord is mentioning, or the speaker Shukadeva Goswami is mentioning, Bhutai Panchabhir Arabde. So it's a dehe, the body is made of 5 elements. And you're not those elements. This is a mistake that a living entity can make out of willful blindness, is to accept the material body as the self. And then, from that, abhuta means dehe de yabhuta sakrit, asakrit. It means that the person then acts in ignorance, that I'm the body. And ahamba metya sadgraha, the next form of ignorance, as one expands the ignorance, is that everything that is in relationship with this body is mine. And that's a big mistake. So the Vedic scriptures clear all this up for us in a very simple way and solve our conundrum and our entanglement here in the material world. Shall I quote a verse that will solve all your problems? Well, not your problems, you don't have any problems, but for the ordinary person in the world who's subjected him or herself to these forms of ignorance.
Yes.
Okay. 33% said yes. Everybody else, cover your ears. In the Sri Upanishad, Ishavasa midam sarvam yat kincha jagatyam jagat tena tyaktena bunjita magradha kasya swidana. Everything animate or inanimate. Does that cover most things? Everything within the universe, animate and inanimate, is controlled and owned by the Lord. One should therefore accept only those things necessary for himself, which are set aside as his quota. And one should not accept other things, knowing well to whom they belong. Urvani veha karmani jiji vishekshitam sama evam tvainanyate sina karma lipate nare. Sri Upanishad goes on to say, if you work in that way, then you won't be entangled. So what's being described here, and in the subsequent verse, tat artam, which means, tat means it's a demonstrative pronoun. It's pointing to something that was mentioned previously. So tat artam, that value, that idea that I'll get something out of working in the bodily conception of life. Kurate karma, if you go on like that, then yad bado yati samsritim, you'll end up back in another womb. You're creating the situation for yourself. And to get out of that, one must, as Prabhupada explains in the Purport, work for Krishna. Yagnarta kamanonyatra loko yam karma bandhana tadartam karma panthaya mukta sangha samachara. This verse also gives us a substantive answer to how to avoid the miseries of this world, being reconsumed into the material nature and taking birth again in a material body, in which Krishna says, whatever work you do, center it on pleasing Krishna. And a little further along in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna gives us another hint, and he uses a metaphor which is easy to remember, of how to live in the world without being consumed or overcome by ignorance. Brahmanyadaya karmani sangham tyakva karotiya lipyatena sapapena padma patram ivamvasa. And this is a metaphor of what? For 20 points. Okay, 20 points for you. It's of a lotus flower. And Krishna says, just as a lotus lives in the water, but it never gets wet, so similarly, one who, Brahmanyadaya karmani, sangam tyakva karotiya, while working, offers the result of the work to Krishna. He doesn't claim that this is for me. It's a subtle change, but this is the enlightened way of working in the world and interacting with the entire cosmic manifestation in such a way that Krishna here says, here meaning the verse I just quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, that you can live in the world but not be affected by it. And therefore you should live like a lotus, which is called Padmaja. Padmaja. Padma means mud, and Ja means to be born. That's the name of a lotus. It's born out of mud, lives in the water, but it's not muddy, and it's never wet. That sounds like a very elongated Buddhist koan. What comes out of mud but is never muddy, lives in the water but is never wet? And the answer is, for 40 points, live like a lotus. Anyway, you're still at 20. So, this is a simple equation, but one worth repeating, so much worth repeating that in one of the most important sections of the Bhagavatam, and of course, what isn't an important section of the Bhagavatam, but some are considered to point to the pinnacle of devotional service, not the least of which is the pastime at Kurukshetra, which is the pastime upon which we base the festival tomorrow of Rath Yatra, where Krishna comes to Kurukshetra, and then his followers all come from Dwarka, and his followers, of course, come from many different places, but most significantly, they come from Vrindavan, having heard that Krishna will be there doing a religious observance during the eclipse of the sun. And at that time, as you all know, Krishna reunites with the residents of Vrindavan. And in the following chapters, chapter 84, that's 82, of course in 83 he meets all of the queens from Dwarka meet with one another and discuss, each one of them discusses how she got married to Krishna. And then 84, Krishna, who's very accommodating there, comes together with all the sages. If we read the list of sages, which is just an indication of who's there, it's a who's who of all the sages in the universe. And Krishna then speaks to them and says that yasyasti bhaktir, no, yes, sorry. Yasyatma buddhi kunapetri dhatuke sadi kalatradishu bhauma ejiti yatirtha buddhi salilena karichichaneshu abhikeshu saeva kukura. This, he says, at a time in which everyone's gathered, all the sages. It's a most esoteric chapter. Topmost sages of the universe are standing there, and Krishna says, "You're not your body." And anybody who thinks they're their body is a fool. It's very similar to this verse today. These verses today pointing to this misconception of being the body. Shukadeva also mentions this in the 10th chapter of the Bhāgavatam. Near the end of the 14th chapter, he discusses how everyone, first of all, he says, what can one not forget in the face of the powerful material energy. So that anyone can forget everything, including his relationship with Krishna and one's own self. Nonetheless, he says, it is for the sake of one's own self that one maintains the body and protects it. In other words, because of the misconception that I am my body, then one considers the body to be dear and maintains it. And it's only for that reason that we consider things in relationship to the body dear. It's because it has some relationship to us. So Shukadeva Goswami then says, Atmanam Makilatmanam. Consider that if yourself and your misconception thereof, of being the body, is so dear to you, imagine how dear the self of yourself is. Atmanam Akilatmanam. He says Krishna is the soul of all souls. It's a thought experiment he gives us. He said, how dear is your body? It's so dear that you'll do anything to protect it. Why is it dear? Because you're in the body. Once you're out of the body, as Prabhupada used to point out, you don't mind if somebody kicks on your face. Prabhupada. Because it's no longer your concern. In fact, other thought experiments would include that if you're here in the temple room and then during the kirtan, your bag seems to have disappeared, and then you go into a panic because your driver's license and all the cash you had in the world was in that bag. And then you realize that it wasn't actually your bag that disappeared, it was somebody else's bag, then you don't feel so bad anymore. Bags are stolen all the time. For that matter, cars are hit all the time. When your car's hit, it's of great concern. And there's a visceral sense of suffering because we're intimately connected with all the items of the material world through our own consciousness, with the sense that they are me, or part of me, as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Dhyayato Vishayam Pumsam Sangas Teshu Vijayate. When you meditate on the body and all the things that you have and you think of them as yours, then he said you make a sangha, or a connection. They become part of you now. And this is the conundrum of the material world. So, circling back for a solution that Krishna, as Hamsavatar, gives to the sages, he says one should detach oneself from one's own mind and come to a position of shakshitva, which means witnesshood, and notice that actually the body and the mind are going on and I'm observing them, but they're not actually me. Krishna alludes to a similar phenomena in Self-Realized Souls in the 5th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, when he says, Naiva kinchit karomi ti yukto manyeta tatvavit pashan shinvan shvishan jigran ashnan gachan panshasan pralapan vishvinan grinan unmishan nimishan napi indriyan indriyateshu vartanta iti dharayan. That a person who's in this consciousness of witnessing the body and not considering the body to be oneself sees that it goes on with all its functions, but he's not actually doing anything. The body's acting as part of material nature, whereas the soul is separate from that material nature. This chapter is important for meditation, remembering what is the consequence of my own consciousness. That is that I'm developing these bodies one after another. And Arjuna asks about this in the 8th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita when he wants to know what karma is. And Krishna says karma is the force of your own consciousness, which is creating future situations, i.e. bodies, in which you'll be forced to inhabit and carry on from there in material life. So Krishna consciousness, a simple switch that one can flip, sorry for the analogy, flip a switch, but it is like that if one considers that all of my work is for Krishna and everything in the universe is paraphernalia to be used in the service of Krishna, then there's a way in which one is no longer obligated or is no longer entangled by that. What's more, one must understand what's beyond the three dimensions of materialistic consciousness, sleeping, awakened consciousness, and sleeping without dreams, which is Turiya, or the fourth dimension. And Krishna is in the fourth dimension. So in the process of Krishna consciousness, when one connects to Krishna, who is transcendental to the three modes of material nature, through the process of chanting Hare Krishna, then one could overcome the fallacy of identifying with the material nature. The holy name has that power. As Rupa Goswami mentions in his Namashtakam, Yadabaso Pyudyan Kablita Bhavatanta Vibhavo Drisham Tatvandanam Api Dishiti Bhakti Pranayam. And that is that even if somebody's blind to the truth, Tattva Andanam means he's blind to the truth. By hearing Hare Krishna, then that person can wake up to a sense of bhakti pranayini, just by hearing a sound vibration that comes from beyond this material creation. What's more, the Bhāgavatam says, Tadvag visago janataga viplavo yasmin prati shlokam babadya bhaktipi namanyanantasya shonkitanya shinvanti gayanti grananti sadhava. That the sound vibration of the Śrimad Bhāgavatam is beyond the material creation. It's from another creation, which isn't contaminated by the modes of material nature. And if one lends one's hearing process to the Bhāgavatam and to the holy names, then one can rise above the three modes of material nature. Mam chayo vyabhicharena bhakti yogena sevate sagunan samatityayitam brahmapuya yakalpate. Krishna gives this direction that by continuing the process of devotional service, one will gradually rise above the three modes of material nature. Let's investigate a little further by having some pertinent questions or reflections. Pertinent, to try to extract something more. Yes? So when the senses get externalized, she'll get a mic, but I'll repeat until she does. Go ahead. Bhāgavatam in this chapter is describing how there's a certain point at which not all souls, but certain souls come to consciousness, and then they become aware of their plight, their existential crisis, that they're souls, but they're in a mood. And this is a point, there is a point at which they become conscious like that. And then they become overwhelmed by the material nature once they come out again. So it's a special circumstance, and it's not all souls, but some souls, as is it emphasized in the chapter earlier, that come to this kind of awareness. In fact, in the commentaries earlier, especially Vishwanath Chakravarti and Jiva Goswami talk about how if you've cultivated jnana, then the little fetus that comes to awareness will have a sense for and an inclination towards jnana. Those who are absorbed in karma will have corresponding sensibilities, what to speak of vikarma. And it's our, again, a repeat, which is, I always find useful. Karma brahmo bhavam vedi. Krishna says in the 8th chapter of the Gita, you're creating the situation for yourself by your own identification and the way in which you're working in the world. And that carries over to times, in such a way that we're forced into various circumstances. But we may, at certain points in our life, get a gift of awareness that I'm not really my material body. And especially this happens deliberately when one hears from self-realized souls and hears from the Bhagavad Gita. So another aspect that's emphasized in this chapter earlier is that one must elevate oneself beyond the mind through the intelligence as a beginning point. And Krishna says a similar thing in the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Evam buddhi param buddva samstapya anamatmana jahishatra mahabaho kamarupam durasadam. He's explained that the river of samsritim that's carrying us along helplessly is because of what he calls lust, kama, which is born from the lower modes of nature, especially Rajagun Tamagun, especially by Rajagun Tamagun. And when Arjuna says, how would one rise above this, Krishna ends by saying, use your intelligence. Evam buddhi param buddva samstapyapanamapana. Because he says, there's a hierarchy that we're dealing with as souls. Indriyani paranyahur indriyebhya param manaha. Manasastu para. I'm sorry. Indriyani paranyahur indriyebhyas param manaha. Manasastatu para buddhir yo buddhe paratastu saha. Says lowest of all are the senses. Above the senses is the mind. Above the mind is intelligence. And above the intelligence is the soul proper. And therefore he says, and Prabhupada emphasizes, if the intelligence becomes contaminated by lust, then you get what you see nowadays. If you want to walk around or look on the internet, that's what you get. When the intelligence becomes contaminated by the lower modes of nature, then people think of myriad ways to enjoy the material nature. And none of them are useful. But if you read Bhagavad Gita, as an example, then your intelligence becomes justified. In other words, put back in order. And just by hearing the Bhagavad Gita, one cannot do without that. In fact, if you don't hear Bhagavad Gita regularly, it's very likely that one would be reconsumed by the ignorance of the material nature. Let's have a couple more. I'll answer in a shorter manner so we can fit a couple more in.
Hare Krishna, thank you very much, Prabhu, for the many points you made. So you mentioned this, the secret of dealing with the material world is to act always for Krishna. Yeah. So many times, Prabhuji, we'll do something, so this is for Krishna. This seems like something nice to offer to Krishna. So I'm doing this, oh, this is for Krishna. But it seems like rather we should act on the order of Krishna. I don't know if the difference is clear.
Yeah, the main point is don't be a rascal. Like Gopalaban, Prabhupada told the story of Gopalaban, and he said, his friends used to criticize him and said, Gopalaban, you're practically an atheist, you never do anything for God. And one day when Gopalaban was carrying a big tray of grains home from the field and the wind came and blew it into the air, he said, I offer that. And Prabhupada said, don't be a rascal like Gopala Bhavan. You have to be sincere. That's the main qualification for spiritual life. You sincerely try to offer something, even if the thing you're offering is insignificant, Krishna will accept it. And that's one of the unique features of being a living entity. You can look into your own consciousness and understand if you're sincere or not. That's pretty scary. But if you can find your own sincerity, there's a sense of eternal satisfaction. Because Krishna consciousness is simple. All you have to do is do the right thing. And all you have to do is sincerely try to do the right thing. And if you do that, there's no real problem in the world. Prabhupada gave the example, that's a longer answer than I thought. But in any case, he gave the example of a bank teller. And if you imagine a bank teller nowadays, and dealing here in New York City with millions of dollars crossing the table, and then if he takes $1 off the top of the stack and puts it in his pocket so he can later on get a root beer on the way home, is that okay? And it was on camera, and then later on he says, all it was $1, and by the way, I bought a root beer, so it's no big deal. It's not okay. So if you think of yourself as a bank teller, bank tellers should know better not to take money off the top of the stack. In any case, Krishna says, Yat koroshi rashnashi yat juhoshi dadasi yat tapasyasi konteya tat kurishva mararpanam. That whatever you do, whatever you eat, etc., do it as an offering to me. So one should start where one can. And I mean, going on Sankirtan, sometimes people, they say you don't have any money. I don't necessarily believe them. But we often ask for something else. Recently we were in Wales, and there was a man smoking a cigarette outside his shop. He was on a break, so he thought he'd have a nice, fresh puff of smoke in his lungs. And he was standing there smoking his cigarette. So I approached him, and we had a group of devotees with us, because we were all out, and they wanted to watch. So I asked them for a donation, and you know this mudra? They don't have any money. And I said, I said, well then, give me the cigarettes, because he had the pack in his hand. And then he thought I wanted to smoke a cigarette, so he pulled one out and gave me one, like he was a friend. And I took it. And then they said, no, I want the whole pack. And he wasn't willing to do that, but I said, well, at least give me the lighter. So he gave me the lighter, and I said, here, I'll give you back the cigarette. And then he was okay for about a half a second until he realized that he couldn't smoke the rest of his cigarettes without his lighter. And then he panicked. He said, I need the lighter back. And I said, listen, I'm going to take this to our church, and I light candles for God, and we're going to make prayers, and you're going to get the benefit. And somehow or other, although it was very hard for him, it hit his intelligence that was probably a good idea. And he was somehow overcome his very strong attachment to the idea that he needed that lighter. And he said, okay, you can keep it. And all the devotees were standing there, and they went, Jai! And he was like surprised. We have it all on video, actually. It's emblematic of the relationship a soul has with the material world. That until there's intervention, one doesn't know how to offer something to God. Oftentimes, Prabhupada would take things like deities. He'd go to see them. There's a story of him getting, is it Shishi Radhakalachandji? When he went to see the deity, and because the deity had a broken finger, Prabhupada said he could come and London Ishvara, so he went there, and he instigated a situation in which he just lifted up the deities and walked out. So people don't know exactly how to give to God, and it's one of the ways in which we learn when we come to Krishna consciousness, how to offer things. But in the beginning, Krishna says in the Gita, one should always be encouraging, inspire people if they have a way. Like one devotee mentioned how she used to bring feathers and little seashells and give them to Prabhupada. Vaikuntanath's wife, Saradiya, she says in her memories she'd find feathers on the beach and bring them to Prabhupada. He accepted them. In any case, wherever the giving may start, and it can always be improved, and then it can become a sense of always giving everything, every breath for Krishna. Well, we're fortunate to hear this chapter. I'd call on more, but I don't want to extend past the allotted time. And tomorrow is Rath Yatra, so Prabhupada said it's a feeling festival, and we can remember that this is, although this philosophy is very practical, it's also very deep and takes us into a realm in which one can become as equally entangled in the loving network of Krishna and all his pastimes as one very easily gets entangled in the material world. So we should just try to entangle ourselves in service, and Krishna will enlighten us from within our heart. And also, very kindly, he removes any of the obstacles from within our hearts if we do a little bit of service or a lot of service, even better. Dear Srila Prabhupada, dear Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Shri Panchatattva, Shri Gauranitai, Shri Radha Govinda, Jagannath, Baladev, Subhadra, if you so desire, please empower us to offer you a beautiful Rath Yatra ceremony tomorrow for the benefit of all the people of New York City and the world. Thank you for considering our request. Om Tat Sat. Everyone agrees with this prayer in whole or in part. Please unmute and say Hare Krishna. Panchakalparusha Kripasindabhevacham Patitanam Pavanibhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Mahananta Koti Vaishnavini Ki Jai.